Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We are about to begin our session titled River of Flesh and Other Stories, The Prostituted Women in Indian Short Fiction, and As If Women Matter, The Essential by Gloria Steinem reader. Shema Sayyed in conversation with the anthology's editor Ruchira Gupta. Shema Sayyed in conversation with the anthology's editor Ruchira Gupta and Khabar Mumtaz. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Shema is a writer, choreographer, and dancer, and she will be moderating this session. Thank you.
Khabar, we'll start with you. Khabar is to ask you to say a few words about this book that Ruchira, that has just come out by Ruchira, compiled, edited, and introduced by Ruchira. Khabar Mumtaz is the chairperson of the National Commission on the Status of Women from 2013 to 2015. Previously, she was CEO of Shirkat Gah. She worked as assistant editor for Viewpoint and senior research fellow at the Center for South Asian Studies, Punjab University. She has served on the governing bodies of several national and international organizations. She's the recipient of Sitara Imtiaz and the Prime Minister's Award for co-authoring her book, Women of Pakistan, 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back. She's one of the 1,000 women worldwide nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 2005. And she's written over 60 research reports and academic publications on women's issues. Khabar, can you please tell us what you thought about the book?
Thank you, Shema, and Assalamu alaikum to all the audience. I am a sort of a last-minute entrant to this conversation, but I responded to this request because I do feel that this is prostitution is one issue that we tend to be silent about, and it's not discussed, and there's not much research done also, except for one or 2 books on the subject, and some writings of foreign anthropologists who've tried to examine and see how prostitution takes place in red light areas, for instance, of Lahore. But as activists, we've not given enough thought to those women who are prostituted and how they get into prostitution and how do we try and engage with them. Can we engage with them? There are many questions about that. And I think this book, this anthology, and the other thing is that the most that we know about prostitutes or their situation is through fiction. Manto's fiction, Ismet Choktai's fiction, other people who've written about prostitutes and have created an empathy for them in many instances of their helplessness in such situations, and they've been and so they've been subject of fiction, but not so much a subject of research as well as of human rights activists taking up their issues. So I think what you have tried to do in this, Ruchira, is really try and analyze what happens and raise some very fundamental questions. And I think those are the questions that we need to debate, because we are, in a sense, in a state of denial about prostitution, what it means, what happens to the women who are there, how do they get there. There are families of prostitutes, there are those trafficked girls and women who find themselves in the hands of pimps and prostitutes, of middlemen. So the issues, I think I'll just point out to what I feel are important issues for us to discuss or debate or to reflect upon at least. You see, you say that, I'll just quote those points from the introduction of this book. It is a very, very good anthology, and I would suggest that people look through it. She says that I was told that some women choose prostitution over marriage, that they find freedom from patriarchal structures in prostitution. And she goes on to say, I was told that prostitution was a livelihood choice many women make when confronted with sweatshop work, domestic servitude, and oppressive marriages, making it almost as a viable choice, or seem to be a viable choice. In another place, she says, almost everyone, and she's talking about having gone and met prostitutes in different situations, she found that they were not always in the best of situations. They were very often young, they were mistreated, abused, and also sick many times. But what was amazing is that I'm again quoting, almost everyone had normalized the violence to such an extent that if asked, they denied having faced any. These are women prostitutes. For the women, the violence inflicted by the customers upon them was paid for and thus couldn't be defined as such. She also raises other issues to look at prostitution as a manifestation of inequality. Inequality that women suffer, and this is an extreme case of inequality. And she says, she even talks about another aspect, which I think we sometimes talk about when we're talking as activists, especially women's rights activists, is of rape in marriage. And you refer to it as the absence of choices prostituted women and their unprostituted sisters face in and outside marriage. So there's a number of key issues that we tend not to discuss because we're all in a state of collective denial. We take it for granted that it happens everywhere, there's not many ways of controlling it. In Pakistan, prostitution is illegal, is banned, and it goes under the name of dancing girls and dancing. And we all know that's a euphemism. So I think I would like to just open with that for you to talk more and maybe at some point to have some sort of a discussion with the audience on some of these issues. How do we go forward on it? Is this a case? And how the extent to which prostitutes can themselves have an agency to be able to get out of their state if they want to get out of their state. So these are a few questions that I found when I read the book and its preface, its introduction, that we need to engage with. These are issues that we don't engage with, we deny. And while we do get through through fiction, the deep, the kindnesses in those women, the oppressiveness, but within them, the humanity in some of those women, we find a lot of very positive characters in those prostitutes, but they just create empathy in us and not much more.
Thank you. Ruchirat, I mentioned this quote earlier as well at the previous launch, that it's often said that journalism is the first draft of history. This is a quote from Hugo de Berg's book on investigative journalism. And by contrast, he says, investigative journalism provides the first rough draft of legislation. You began you entered this area of investigation through your investigative journalism, and indeed you have gone on and played a key role in legislative changes at various levels. Could you please tell us, a snapshot of your journey?
Thank you. Salam alaikum. I'm so pleased to be in Karachi and sharing my book and ideas with all of you. This morning I had a wonderful interaction with some of your leading feminists, and I'll go back with those happy memories of people who are making such huge change here. And just to share experiences of what I've done in India and what we are trying to do globally as a feminist family. My own journey began as a journalist, as Shaima was saying. I was walking through the hills of Nepal 18 years ago when I came across rows of villages which didn't have any girls from age 15 to 45. And I began to ask the men who were drinking tea, playing cards, where the girls were. And they said, don't you know they all are in Bombay? Now, Bombay was 1,400 kilometers away. These villages were really remote, even 2 hours away from the highway. So I couldn't understand how that could be true. And like a good journalist, I went into the villages. And I found that a smooth supply chain, which I call the flesh trade, existed from that village to the brothels of Bombay. There was the local village procurer, who could be an uncle, a brother, a neighbor, who would offer poor, starving farmers $50, $150, 5,000, 6,000 Nepali rupees, and take the daughter, who was normally between the ages of 9 and 13, and tell the farmer that he would get the daughter a job in the big city. Sometimes even say that he would put her into prostitution and say, but prostitution will give her food, she will have a roof over her head, maybe she'll send some money back home. And the farmer was so isolated and he did not know the realities of prostitution, so he would let the girl go. And this man would then cluster together 3 or 4 girls in the big cities of Biratnagar and Kathmandu, and there they would be handed over to a set of transporters who would take them to the border of India and Nepal, and there would be the corrupt border guards. Wink, wink, nod, nod. And the girls were taken across the border, and on the other side were the shabby lodges. These lodges were formed of plastic sheets and cement sheets. Here the girls were locked up for 2 or 3 days, beaten, drugged, till their spirits were completely subjugated. And when they were ready to do anything, they were handed over to another set of transporters, who would put them on trucks, on buses and trains, and take them to the brothels of Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi. There were the pimps. He would negotiate the price of these girls depending on her beauty. Now, by beauty, what do I mean? Fair skin was at a premium. Voluptuousness was at a premium. The younger, the better. The youngest I have met is a 7-year-old. And then these girls were handed over to brothel managers, who would lock up these girls for the next 5 years in small rooms with iron bars on the window, and bring them out for 8 or 10 customers every night. And behind these brothel managers were the landlords, the money lenders, and the organized criminal networks. And all this was happening in plain sight, absolutely openly. So I was really shocked. As a journalist, I'd covered war and famine and hunger and caste conflict and ethnic conflict, but I'd never seen this kind of deliberate exploitation of one human being by another. So again, as a journalist, I responded by making a documentary. The documentary is called The Selling of Innocence, and I went on to win an Emmy for outstanding investigative journalism for it. But I spent so much time inside the brothels of Bombay talking to the women to make my documentary that I could not walk away. And when I was in New York in the Broadway Marquis Hotel, surrounded by light and glamour and job offers, I felt journalism was limiting, kind of irrelevant, and I wanted to do more about the system of deep exploitation that I saw. And so I quit journalism, and I did 2 things. One was that I took a consultancy with the United Nations to travel around the world and see how women in prostitution were combating AIDS. But at the same time, what I did was I went back with my award to the brothels of Bombay, and I asked the women what to do. And the women said, you have to help us. And I said, I don't know how to help you. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a teacher, I'm not a social worker. I'm just a journalist. And they said, but you know English, you have access to influence, money, power. I said, yes, that I do. And I said, but remember, the struggle is yours. Your lived experience is what you have to bring to the front, to the world, if you really want change. And at that time, the women told me one thing. They said that whatever had happened to them had happened. They were willing to speak up because they wanted to save their daughters from the same fate. And so based on that, we started the NGO called Apne Aap. And the idea was to amplify the voices of women who had been silenced by being locked up in these brothels. They were also silenced through stigma, shame. They were told they were bad women. They were told that their testimony did not matter. If they tried to run away from the brothels, very often the police officers would send them back, telling them that this is your life now. So to break the silence was a very, very big thing. But to break the silence, first the women needed the protection of even surviving. So first thing we did was open a community classroom inside the red light district, started educating the children of the women in prostitution, and slowly, once the children were ready for school, we organized the mothers as what we call a Amma Samuh, a mothers group, and told the mothers to go and beg with the principals, plead with them to admit their children. And the principal, of course, said, other parents will object, we cannot admit your daughters. The women cried, begged, and said, our children are children too. And the principal admitted them. We had already talked to the principal behind the scenes. And this was the first taste of victory that the women saw that they could achieve through this process of organizing and speaking up. The children have gone on now, I'm talking about now 14 years later. Some are in college, one is an animation artist, another is the manager of a Domino's pizza parlor, some are running gas stations, the first batch isn't moved on beyond college. So more than 1,000 of these children have moved out of the red light area, and they are helping their mothers by renting rooms outside the red light area, taking their mothers out. And the mothers' dreams are now moving from Bombay to Calcutta to Bihar to Delhi. And the women, because they are speaking up, because they are sharing stories with each other, and we are documenting those stories and bringing out our own newspaper called Lal Batti Dastaveज, Red Light Dispatch, which the women sit in circles across the country, reading stories of their own lives of exploitation, stigma, betrayal, exploitation to each other. They have begun to realize that they are not crazy. The system is crazy. And their voices have got amplified. And finally, as Shaima was asking me to speak about how did this from journalism to activism, and then from activism, what did we do with these voices? That when these voices began to speak up, we began to push for changes in law. Because we realized what we were doing with that one child, with those 800 children, with the 20,000 women who were part of Apne Aap, it was still first aid. Because prostitution is a system, and according to the United Nations, 27 million people, most of them women and children, are trapped in prostitution all over the world, of which 3 million are in India. India is really the epicenter of it, our subcontinent. And so, we began to realize that this is such a huge tsunami that we can only help a few, and the traffickers are much more organized than us. So unless we bring about change in policy and law, nothing will change. So we began to knock on the doors of the United Nations, and we began to build friends and allies all over the world, asking for changes in the protocol. And we got the first UN protocol to end trafficking in persons, especially women and children, passed in the UN, which has now become the standard for all our countries to change their laws to. And 110 countries since then have changed their laws. We did the same with the United States. The United States did not have a law on trafficking. They didn't even know that trafficking existed. And so again, I took my documentary, The Selling of Innocence, showed it at the Senate, the United States Senate, testified as an Indian citizen, but said that there's a commonality in our inequalities, and we must understand that we are facing the same problem. It's low-caste girls in India, but it's children of color in America, Native American girls. The average age of prostitution in America is between 13 and 15. So the United States also changed its law, created a new law called the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And now we are going from country to country trying to change the law. And the voices of the women, the first women who were part of Apne Aap, they have given courage to their sisters have given courage to other sisters, and they all are speaking up. So now in France, we have just managed to change the law this week. Ireland has already changed its law. Philippines has already changed its law. Sweden, Norway, countries which believe in gender inequality have all changed the law. And the most important thing in the law that we have changed is that we have shifted the blame from the victim to the perpetrator. So what we have done is decriminalized the selling of sex. So we recognize that the prostitution of women and children is because of their absence of choice. It's not a choice. And so therefore, they are not to be punished under any legal system at all. And we demand that countries invest in their basic needs. We have criminalized the traffickers, the pimps, the recruiters, the brothel keepers, the brothel managers, transporters, all of that. And we have penalized the Johns, the customers. So prostitution is really a demand-driven system. The sexual exploitation of women is a demand-driven thing. It's not that women are choosing to be exploited. Somebody is taking advantage of the inequality and exploiting them. And that is the struggle I've been having all these years, is to make policymakers, other feminists, other allies understand it. And that's why the book, River of Flesh and Other Stories, The Prostituted Woman in Indian Short Fiction, is also one such attempt. Because very often, you know, what's in plain sight, we so normalize it, we don't do anything about it. And these are modern writers from our subcontinent who had the empathy to see what was going on. And hopefully these stories will also make you realize what's really going on, that the prostitution of these women is a function of their inequality. And also, prostitution does not get them out of poverty. Most women become poorer in prostitution. So it also deepens their inequality. It's not really helping them out at all. And this is something we need to understand from our most modern writers who've written. Manto has written a story about a woman who was constantly being pimped. She was constantly being pimped. And she says that she wants to go to sleep, but she cannot choose when to go to sleep, because every time she wants to fall asleep, the pimp comes back with one more customer. And the final part of the story is she's sleeping peacefully. And the customer looks around to see how come she's sleeping peacefully, and he sees that her pimp's head is smashed in. There's another story which is set in South India, and it's set in Tamil Nadu, and it's called The Last Customer. In that, this woman's body is so used and used and used by constant body invasion by different customers, that she's left with nothing. She's just breathing in and breathing out. She's lying on the edge of a field, and she looks at the sky, and she sees a vulture in the sky, and she imagines that he might be the last customer. So there are stories like that on and on and on, and you know, you'll of course have access to the book. It's available at Oxford Bookstore here, so you will see it. But you know, it just is to help us build empathy for that person.
That's, you mentioned the Traffic Victims Protection Act that the United States Senate passed in 2000. I got that from your website. So was that passed before the United Nations protocol?
Both were passed the same year.
Oh, I see.
So we were lobbying simultaneously with whoever we could. And
the United Kingdom is still a country which is not one of those countries that has passed your law. It's one of the holdouts.
Yeah, the United Kingdom still hasn't changed the law, but we suspect now with Ireland having changed it, with France having changed it, all the pimps and traffickers will probably go to London unless they change the law.
Can I just share something here? When we talk about the laws, in South Asia, this is not, huh? You don't. In South Asia, in SAARC, there's a convention on trafficking of women and children for prostitution. We do have a convention, and which is followed by lawmaking. And Pakistan, zor se, okay. Pakistan has passed an ordinance in 2000 regarding trafficking and prostitution.
But that's only for international, or
No,
is it
that is cross-border. South Asia, cross-border. And now it's being reviewed, and the National Commission has proposed the renewal of it to apply to domestic trafficking also, because in Pakistan, domestic trafficking is also very high. There's also some documentation of cross-border trafficking done by Lawyers for Human Rights, Zia Avant's group. In fact, he started working on women trafficked from Bangladesh to Pakistan and saved a lot of women. But as you say very rightly, there's a whole system which spreads, and the networks are strong. And unless we, there's a collective action against it, we don't find that it works well enough. I mean, as a lawyer, Zia Avant did try and protect a lot of women, rehabilitate them, send them back. But that obviously hasn't taken, hasn't really dealt with the issue which lies within the whole process of it, the system of it. Yeah. And we see the system of it across borders, even from Central Asia to India or Pakistan. And that's where the challenge is. How do we as a society try, and in spite of having laws, we don't see many people being actually tried under the law.
Yeah, I wanted
What
to
do we
bring,
do?
that brings me to the question of implementation. I was just seeing one of the conferences you were part of in Delhi, the Harvard conference, where there was this conclusion that actually the real issue is implementation. And I think even after the Indian law was passed, there was a time when it was just not having much effect. So what kind of resources and programs do you have to enforce these laws once you pass them? The challenges, if you could talk about it.
There's two kinds of implementation I would like to talk about, Shema. One is implementation of investment in the last girl, who's the one who's most likely to be prostituted. And by the last girl, I mean the weakest person I know, the 13-year-old who's likely to be trafficked or is already in a brothel, who's poor, who's female, who's low caste, and who's a teenager, and whose intersectional inequalities are taken advantage of because she can take no decision for herself. She is not even allowed to dream. She cannot decide whether she's going to go to school or stay at home. She cannot decide whether she's going to play or help with chores. She cannot decide what to eat, when to eat. She cannot decide who to marry, when to have a child. She cannot take any decision for herself. And this girl is often the one who has the least skills, the least power, the least control, who the traffickers use and abuse and sell. And this is the girl that we need to invest in. So we need to make sure she has food, she has housing, she has a set of at least 2 clothes to be able to go to school. She needs to be able to be sent to school. She needs proper education in that school. In the meantime, what is happening as I'm talking to you while trying to confront the this tsunami-like problem of prostitution, what's happening is budgets are being cut in country after country for that last girl. In my own country, midday meals are being cancelled for poor girls.
But how do we, I'm sorry, I was just wanting to get to how do we implement, so for example, you mentioned one of the things was that how do we get people to follow these laws is to write a short law. So for example, in Norway, the law is only 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs long, so that people the policemen or the prostitutes who want to use the law to protect themselves, they don't have a difficult time reading 20 pages of jargon. That's one way that you help implement a law. Are there any resources? So it's coming back to the law. How does one implement the law?
Okay, so the other part which Hema wants to know about is, one is increasing budgets for the last girl and making sure those are spent on the last girl. But the other is creating laws which can protect her. And that is addressing the demand, so arresting her traffickers, arresting her pimps, her brothel keepers, so that the system doesn't exist like a magnet for people to know that they can go and sell girls and men to know that they can go and buy girls. And for that, what we need is really huge sensitization of our law enforcement officers, of our prosecutors, so that they know what the law is. We need better laws so that the blame is shifted from the victim to the perpetrator. The girl is not punished, the woman is not punished, but it's the brothel keeper, the pimp, who is punished. And this is the normal law in Sweden and in Norway and Iceland now. It's known as the Nordic model, in which the selling of sex is not criminal, the purchase of sex is criminal. And this has brought down trafficking in a huge way. And most men now, surveys are showing in Sweden and Norway, don't even want to buy sex. They want sex with collaboration and participation, not sex with domination. So it's changing the culture of those countries as I speak. But the other thing that you mentioned very truly and very rightly is that the law has to be simple. Because the person who needs to use the law must understand it. She should not have to depend on a battery of lawyers to interpret the law, find the right clause for her. And so in India, when we were trying to change the law on trafficking, we were trying to look at best practice laws from the whole world. And we were pulling out the Norwegian law, the Philippines law, the Swedish law. And when my intern pulled out the Norwegian law, I kept telling her, this must be just the preamble. Where is the rest of it? Because it was 2 paragraphs, and I could understand the whole law in those 2 paragraphs. It was in plain English, very easy to understand, not Latin. And, even the last girl could have understood it.
It's really, I heard you say that India's new anti-trafficking law, now I'm quoting you, also says beautifully that the consent of a victim to her own exploitation will still put the blame on the perpetrator who used consent to traffic her. So I just wanted to discuss this issue of consent. I mean, it is a beautiful, progressive law. I wanted to ask whether this is common in all the
Yes.
110 countries?
Not in all 110
Or
countries,
whatever number it is, 100
but
or
it's
so.
definitely there in the UN protocol. It's there in Sweden, it's there in Norway, Iceland, Philippines, Ireland, and in India, where we have put down the fact that abuse of a position of vulnerability is considered abuse even if the woman consents, because she's consenting under very unequal circumstances. She's not choosing to be born poor. She's not choosing to be born a girl. Sometimes she's not choosing to be born in a famine-affected area or a place where there's conflict or war. Most of her choices are taken away. So if she consents, she's consenting under unequal circumstances. So in the UN protocol, we first put that the consent of a victim will be considered irrelevant, and the trafficker would still be considered a trafficker if he's exploited her. And there I want to just mention one concept that we've been trying to float also, is that there is a difference between welcome sex and consensual sex. Because people may consent to sex under many different circumstances. You may be married to the man, you may be a child, your husband may be pimping you, it could be anything. There could be many different reasons where you may consent to sex. But welcome sex is very different.
Richa, you also testified, it says here in your bio that so I just wanted to let you know, in 2009, Gupta won the Clinton Global Citizen Award, and in 2007, she won the Abolitionist Award at the UK House of Lords. In 2008 and 2009, you addressed the UN General Assembly on Human Trafficking. So if that UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking was passed in 2000, then what were you testifying in 2008 and 2009 for the United Nations about?
I was trying to get the United Nations to create a fund for victims of trafficking. And I wanted them to create frameworks and processes based on the UN protocol, which would be victim-friendly. Because, we had the protocol, but nobody knew how to implement it because it hadn't been turned into, what we call the Criminal Procedure Code in law. So same way processes for it. And so therefore, I would keep taking victims of trafficking from the whole world to the United Nations to get member states to understand what victim-friendly justice meant. When we said that consent is irrelevant, they had to understand how a victim consented. So I would take delegations of victims to the UN General Assembly, to the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Sometimes if I could not take a victim, I would go myself and speak on behalf of victims and address the whole UN General Assembly to do that. And it did result in the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime creating a trafficking fund for survivors.
So I wanted, go ahead. I wanted to say this is a great, something that for us, if we want, here in Pakistan, if we want to bring about change, that also so having those victims speak for themselves at the United Nations was, a best practice that we can learn from. Then you also did that, I believe, for the Indian Congress, that helped them also understand how consent happens in prostitution, and as a result, you have this progressive law. Is that right?
Yeah, on 16 December, you all must have read about the rape that happened in my country, the brutal rape of that paramedic student who was going home after watching a movie called Life of Pi. And, she was raped with objects and then she was murdered. That triggered a moment in our national consciousness where we had a movement. All of us were out on the streets, we were getting water cannoned, we were speaking on TV, and we were demanding a change in the law to define sexual harassment in a completely different way. We said we don't want words like eve teasing, we don't even consider the word sexual harassment big enough, we want to use the word sexual assault, and we said everything under which a woman is sexually abused should be made part of the new Criminal Law Amendment Act. A commission of inquiry was set up by Parliament called the Verma Commission to create the new law. and my NGO, Apne Aap, took lots of women in prostitution to go and testify to the Verma Commission, saying that prostitution is commercial rape. So even laws on trafficking and prostitution should be part of this cluster of laws under which sexual abuse is being criminalized to this extent, and laws are being made stricter. And these women were brave enough to hold press conferences, they marched on the streets, they gave public speeches outside Parliament. And I remember taking some of them from Bihar and UP, who are members of my organization, to meet chief ministers like Lalu Yadav and Mulayam Singh Yadav, who did not want to change the law at that time. And they had said that this law would give more power to the police, because as low caste, backward class leaders, they were worried about the police getting more power. And when I took these women, young women, to go and testify to their chief ministers, it changed their minds, because suddenly they began to see them as young women from their state. And the next day, I remember Mulayam Singh Yadav had said on TV that he would not let the law pass. Next morning, he went to Parliament and voted for the law. And journalists asked him, ki, Netaji, aapko raat ko kya ho gaya? You know, what made you change your mind? He heard a girl speak.
Very good. Can I just? Well, I think that the journey that you have traced is really the journey of an activist role, where you organize the women to be also their own agents. And I think that's how we've all arrived at reforms and change of law in our own country, that unless you mobilize people and have them speak out. But on the other hand, I think we also we have to create options for these women.
Yeah.
And those options could mean, maybe safe houses for them initially, or shelters, or from where they can be brought into the mainstream.
Absolutely.
And I think as a starting point, I see in Pakistan, because we haven't got that kind of information about prostitutes, except from, some films will reflect their situation, or fiction. There's stereotyping of them also. And then we need to, I'm thinking more of how we take up the issue of these women, and there are hundreds and thousands of them that are subjected to, and they also have a very, very short lifespan within which they can be active, and they then get condemned to life. So for that, I think that we need to have parallel processes. We have to start doing work on them, to find research, get across to them, helping them organize if they want to be organized, what options we have to offer. It is something that we need to take up as a social issue that so far I don't think we have, and we have sort of failed to do it. And this is a bit of inspiring your work. It takes years, and we all know, all of us who've struggled for women's rights in Pakistan, that it doesn't happen with one demo or two campaigns. Yeah. It needs consistent and persistent pursuit.
So Ruchira has done some very inspiring work in that sense, in the sense that Apne Aap has made, just following up on this thread that you started, that she has made collaborations with Tata Group and with different private companies, so that they are training the women in your organization to transition, so that they're training them in accounting, and there's some five-star hotel who's teaching them how to cook, how to start catering business. So can you tell us a bit about how that's going about?
Yeah, all kinds of people are now coming forward to help. Initially I also had people who would say, they use bad words like Randi, and they said, I will not give you money to work with Randis, So this is, I'm talking about a 20-year-old journey, and it's not easy, There was pushback, and, why was I working with whores, what was going on, etc. It's only now that, after Clinton gives an award, or House of Lords gives an award, or suddenly there's a girl in college in New York, and now, yes, we are getting support from the private sector in society, where the stigma and the taboo has reduced somewhat. It's still a long way to go. So, the Tatas were helping to train the women in computers, the Tata Consultancy Service. There is Domino's is employing some of our women as parlor managers. There is a chain of gas stations, petrol pumps, who are employing women to run the pumping in the gas station, etc. So now change is happening, and one thing is leading to another. But the first thing was speaking up, because till the women could speak up, this was stigmatized, and the blame was the woman's. But when she began to speak about what really goes on to her, and how it really was her absence of choice and how she wanted a different future for her daughter, then society began to suddenly realize that, it wasn't bad women who wanted more sex or were lazy and did not want to do a job who were hanging around in the brothels, but it was farmers' daughters from places where there was drought. It was places where there was ethnic conflict, where traffickers would go and pull out these girls. It was girls in slums. So, we have to make sure, and exactly what she was saying, that, budget allocations. Very, very important that there are budget allocations for these people because they have such precarious lives. And if there are no options, then very often they just die very quickly. The rates of mortality in prostitution are high. And young. People die by the time they're 30 or 35 from diseases, from suicide attempts, from abortion. So there are lots of issues. But yes, now slowly it takes time, but people begin to come and join and help and all kinds of things.
So you've got Tata, and who else is on board?
I have APJ, which does the Lit Fest in Calcutta. They donate libraries to us. I have University of Southern Maine, which has agreed to give our students free law education in colleges in America. I have St. Xavier's. It's a whole bunch of colleges across India, Jesuit schools who've agreed to educate 100 of our children. I have Gujarat Ambuja. It's like this big cement company and construction company who are sponsoring our children. So, across the board now, more and more people are coming forward.
That's great. I wanted to say, some very simple, speaking of implementation, some very simple steps that you took. For example, you said that there are laws in India that are supposed to provide food stamps or to provide, different welfare to these women. But some of them, because they are illiterate, they haven't even bothered to get their ID card made. And so without an ID card, you can't access these things. So just this little thing of getting ID cards made for them and showing them what their laws are really helped a lot. This is something that Apne Aap did. Anyway, I wanted to also just talk about, in your book, it's very interesting because you've got this idea of the last girl very much with where the underage girl who's a child is being raped as a prostitute. But you've also got the story of a woman who's extremely well known as a singer in Lahore. It's an Amrita Pritam story set in Lahore, where a very famous singer who's renowned and respected for her art is serving one client for several decades. He keeps her very beautifully in her house. But you've included that in the same book, and this speaks to, again, the idea of consent. And another thing that you posted was this article about there's a debate about good prostitution versus bad prostitution. So the idea of abolition isn't taken into consideration in Germany because it is believed that good prostitution exists. I'm quoting from an article that you posted. It's clear that child prostitution is not tolerated. Likewise, so-called forced prostitution is also considered evil. But prostitution between two adults who supposedly consent mutually, why not? Why forbid this decision between two adults? And so then this writer, what's her name? It's a psychologist, Ingeborg Kraus. Yeah, she gave a lecture, talking about investigating this consent of prostitution between two adults. And this also, I think it comes to, she talks about all kinds of psychological trauma that these women might have experienced as a child, and even if once they make that choice, all the violence that they are then opening themselves up to, which they wouldn't know before they made that, that bad decision. And it also relates to this idea that you're talking about demand being key in this. It's for sexual harassment. Women who are sexually harassed into sleeping with their bosses, otherwise they will lose their jobs. This is also coercive sex. This is rape, form of rape, because these women will need the money for whatever reason with their children, or for whatever reason we all need money. And so this is also happening. Women are being prostituted not just in the brothels, but in several levels in our society. So could you talk about this idea of consent a bit more?
That's a very tough question because it requires so many unpacking of like an onion of so many layers. But I would say that, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse is so rampant in our society of women because women are unequal. And people can take advantage of them. The powers that be are all men, all the bosses are men, all the decision makers are men. They even decide on what kind of promotions are going to be taken care of, how, and it's like a male club very often who talk to each other. So until, we have more participation of women in decision making, politically, economically, things will not change. And for women to participate equally in decision making, we have to have equal abilities. And to have the equal abilities, we need access to education. We need access to job training, which again, we don't have the same amount. And therefore, already we are like bonsais, and then told to compete with giant trees. And we really, really need to be able to have the same access. The other thing is that women are always taught not to talk about money. We are supposed to be the ones who are supposed to look after culture and stay at home, etc. Whereas men are supposed to be in charge of money and controlling money and all of that. And a woman who talks about money is considered, there's a shame around it, that, she's money-minded or she's mean, etc. And that also keeps her from actually negotiating for equal pay, for promotions or for higher salaries. And so therefore there is a lack of economic opportunity and economic inequality also that women face and which people take advantage of. So we have to be able to go there too as well, that women should be as comfortable with money as men are.
Yes, and that brings me to the sexual harassment law in Pakistan, which Fawzia Saeed has helped to pass. She, actually my understanding is that in Pakistan, when Fawzia Saeed fought her case, sexual harassment, she gave a speech somewhere in the US where she said that the United Nations people who resolved her case told her, congratulated her, and said that it was easy for them to solve, or that it helped, that it went in her favor, the fact that she and her group of women did not ask for any money as compensation for their sexual harassment, and that hers was the first case that came before the United Nations of women, because the United Nations has like thousands of sexual harassment cases. Fawzia Saeed's group of women was the first group that did not ask for compensation. So she was making this distinction between her group and the other women who went before her. And sure enough, since she was responsible for having the sexual harassment law passed in Pakistan, no woman who's been sexually harassed in Pakistan can ask for financial compensation for monies lost or for health damages, or so our law still has a ways to go as far as money, because if you can talk about that.
But actually the law is for sexual harassment, and the issue of compensation is not directly linked with that, but it can be, as you say, it can be. That's right. And there are now more and more cases of sexual harassment coming into the ombudsman's offices at the federal level and in the Punjab. And Sindh has just now set up an ombudsman's office, and it is beginning to have. But that law is also very interesting. It ensures that by law every institution should have a committee, an implementation committee. And we found that in many instances, just the formation of that committee is a deterrent in itself. And it's gone down to the district level in the public sector. At least I can tell you that in some parts, at least in Punjab and in some parts of other provinces also, it is being implemented and instituted and has been Also, there are implementation watch committees formed. But still we have a long way to go. That's not the end of harassment. Still there are problems in complaining but having a law helps.
Of course it
That's the
does,
most
yeah.
important thing.
Yeah,
And then we have to have other laws also that can be invoked which are still not invoked. So awareness of laws is very important, and also the knowledge of the implementers about the laws is extremely important. You'll be surprised that many magistrates in Pakistan are not aware of all the laws that exist. They take the most the major prevalent ones are used almost conventionally. So I think there is a whole area that we need to address when we're talking about, but I think we are veering a little bit away from this whole issue of prostitution, because I think it is a very serious issue,
Well, it's
and we
all-
need to take up. It is, but a harassment where you have a law that can look after you, to a prostitution which has no law to cover it, except for banning, and banning is not enough.
It's all related to consent. Can we open it up to questions?
Yeah.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk on the subject. I just wanted to know that child labor and bonded labor, which are problems in Pakistan, and I think they are problems in India also.
Yes.
What are the commonalities with prostitution? These two misdeeds.
Thank
with
you.
prostitution.
Labor
Thank you.
and labor trafficking.
Actually, thank you for reminding us about that. So, in the UN protocol, the purpose of trafficking is for several things. One is child labor, domestic servitude, cheap labor, prostitution, organ trade, and child soldiers. So there's a whole range of things for which human trafficking happens, and child labor is very clearly defined in that. Now, in terms of is there any connection between child labor and sexual exploitation? Of course, because children who are being used for labor exploitation are also sexually abused, both in domestic servitude, in other enterprises, in construction work. And there's a continuum of abuse. So a girl is sold into domestic servitude, and there she's also abused by family members, and then she's very often put into prostitution when she's no longer useful as someone who can work in the house, as well as boys who are being sold for construction work, to work in restaurants, to work in different places. They are also being gang raped and sexually abused. So there is definitely a link between child labor and child sexual exploitation. And now a new link is coming up, which is organ trade. The kidney and corneas of these children are being taken away and sold.
Oh God, organ trade is very high.
It's become very big now.
I want to bring up two things. One of them is that we are really talking about brutal rape or prostitution, and there's a big leap from here to sexual harassment in workplace. And focusing on that, there's one thing. This whole business of choosing the sex of the child is the place where it all starts. And that I wonder if this enormous rape culture which has developed in India has anything to do with the fact that there is a huge imbalance in male and female children, and this has happened in China, and China is importing women from Korea, North Korea, to fulfill these kind of things. And the other is that AIDS has not been brought up, that there is a thread of AIDS in India which follows the truck routes where these prostitutes serve the truckers. And right now, all over the world, India has the largest number of HIV positive individuals.
Thanks. When we have a question.
It's a comment.
I think it was just a comment. Just a comment.
I just need to ask, like Ms. Ruchira was telling us the story, like a journey of 14, 15 years to set up the schools and everything there in the outside the brothel house. And as you said, the mafia was very strong. So isn't it you face any difficulty to set up the schools outside the brothel house? And you were saying like all the children who were educated and they were setting up. So how come, didn't you face any difficulty to set up the school and everything
Every hour, every day we face difficulty.
That's what the question in my mind.
I didn't talk about that because I thought I must give the story of hope so that we realize that prostitution doesn't have to be inevitable. Our offices have been attacked, our furniture has been stolen, I've had a knife pulled out on me, my staff members have been stabbed, corrupt police officers have even arrested some of my staff members and kept them in a police lockup for 3 nights till I went to the National Human Rights Commission. So it's a constant battle, and for every girl or woman we are able to help, there are thousands of unknown girls or women who we cannot help. One of our members was murdered 2 years ago. We still have not been able to get proper investigation done, and that's constantly happening. So the women are being beaten black and blue for joining Apne Aap. It's a political struggle as much as an economic struggle, and the two are going, and a social struggle. So it's a struggle at all levels that Apne Aap is waging. And when you take on a struggle, there's backlash. And the more united we are, the more we can take it on. And therefore, the fact that I started with 22 women in prostitution, and now the organization has more than 20,000 members who are women in prostitution and their family members. Plus, we have friends and allies all over the world. Recently in India, I was traveling with an Irish survivor of prostitution who came to launch my book in India in solidarity. So, there's strength in collectivizing. And we are doing that. And of course, we are facing the mafia. We are facing a lot of social backlash also, and political backlash too. There is a whole bunch of people who want to legalize prostitution. In my own country, there's a move to legalize child labor in audiovisual industry and in family enterprises. There's a budget cut in midday meals and education for girls. So, of course, we face challenges every day, every step of the way.
And Ruchira, can you talk about legalizing prostitution in a welfare state like Germany, where if a woman comes and she's lost her job, she needs financial help, the state will tell her to become a prostitute because it's legal, and so it's considered a legitimate form of work now.
Sex work.
Yeah, so that's the other challenge we have, is that, somebody spoke about AIDS, and somebody else was talking about what are the different approaches to dealing with prostitution. And there's one group of public health people who say that why don't we legalize pimping and brothel keeping? And if we legalize pimping and brothel keeping, we can regulate the brothels and make sure condoms are available for the customers who come there, and women will have regular health checkups, so they'll be better off and the customers will be better off. But actually, out of 10 customers, 5 will use a condom and 5 will not, and they will just pay a little extra money to have sex without condoms, is what we found inside red light districts. And legalizing pimping and brothel keeping only helps the sex industry. It doesn't help the women, because eventually with the repeated body invasion, there's one thing that you cannot legislate away in prostitution, and that is body penetration. And that body penetration has both physical and mental consequences, which cannot be done away with. Research is showing that women in prostitution suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is worse than returning war vets. And you can only imagine what the repeated body contact does, the invasion of the body again and again by millions of customers to a woman's body, from insomnia, which Manto spoke about, to the revulsion for smelly feet, which Kamleshwar talks about in River of Flesh, Maas Ka Darya, to the fact that the body is so decayed that the woman can't even stand straight. Her back is aching because she has to stand on the street all the time, to AIDS, which you spoke about, tuberculosis, jaundice, repeated suicide attempts, all of it which a woman is subjected to. And, this cannot be done away with because of the body invasion. And so the idea of legalizing pimping and brothel keeping can only legalize a very inherently exploitative industry, which then will pose to us a question in the coming decades, that what do we define as the nature of livelihood itself for all of us? What will happen to all our labor struggles? What do labor struggles want? All labor struggles in the world want minimum wages. In prostitution, there can be no such thing as minimum wages, because you earn less as you grow older, because you're no longer commercially viable.
Okay, one last question.
Can you tell us how this problem was dealt with in the Soviet Union and in Communist China of Mao Zedong?
Okay. So, In Soviet Union, the way it was dealt with was investment in bigger budget allocations for girls and women who were at risk. So investment in their housing, in their education, so that they were less at risk to being prostituted. Investment in their children, so that the children would at least not be stuck in the cycle of intergenerational prostitution, and also no punishment of the women.
Hello. Hi. I just have,
There's one more question.
I have two small questions. One to Ms. Kawar. I wanted to ask her that the struggle that they had in India, would it not be impossible in Pakistan with the zina laws and the hudud laws in place? Does it not just victimize women immediately? You could not go and say that such and such thing has happened, because that would put you in jail immediately before any investigation was done. Is that not true? And sorry, one last question to you, Ms. Ruchira. I just wanted to ask you that, please tell me that that passage has been disrupted from Nepal to Bombay. Has it, or is it still in place?
It was disrupted for a few years because we had a fantastic minister in Nepal called Anuradha Koirala, who ran an NGO called Mighty Nepal, and she became a women's minister for some time. So she made sure that the police was trained to protect the girls, send them back home if traffickers were taking them. She invested in women and girls in the villages where they were, with schools and village development councils. She also made sure the traffickers were given very, very high punishment. So it did come down, but then you know that Nepal recently had a very bad earthquake, and the same villages which were the most at risk were destroyed. After that, Nepal has just been through a very severe economic blockade. So people have actually had no cooking fuel and all of that. So again, there's a little bit of a pipeline which has started.
On the hudud ordinances and zina ordinance especially, you know, the activists in Pakistan actually mobilized against that particular law. And after almost 25 years of struggle, the zina ordinance was amended in 2006 through Women Protection Act. And after that, rape is now part of the Criminal Procedure Code. It's no longer part of the hudud. It is part of the hudud, but it become inapplicable because a woman's evidence now as testimony holds in the court. So there has been a change, and there has been a very drastic dropping down of numbers of women who used to be arrested and were in jail for under the zina ordinance. So that has happened already. And there are two rape laws. One has been passed by the Senate, and another one is in the National Assembly, which is seeking to further strengthen the rape laws as well as provide for rehabilitation of rape victims.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And before I end, I just want the last word. So I want all of you, as you leave this room, to do two things. One is that when you think prostitution, think men.
Yes.
And the other is that, once a British reporter asked Gandhiji that, Mr. Gandhi, why do you always travel third class? And he said, because there is no fourth class.
Also, it's one more announcement. The books are available for sale at Liberty Books. You can get them at Liberty Books. You can also get the same books at Oxford. Oh, and they're also right outside. There's a store. You can buy them.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more announcement is the session in Umair Aziz Syed in conversation with Hina Rabbani Kar has been moved to the main garden at 4:15. The session with Hina Rabbani Kar in conversation Umair Syed has been moved to the main garden at 4:15 p.m. The next session in this room will be higher learning at 5:30.